Hello and welcome to the Unity Timeline course, in which you will learn how to create cutscenes. Trust me, it's easier than you think. I'm Mario, a teacher, game developer, and creator of the YouTube channel Root Games. We will create cutscenes for 2D games, but you can easily apply the knowledge you will get to create 3D cutscenes. Let's take a look at examples. The first example will teach you the basics and it can be used as intro cutscene. Everything you see on the screen is animated. I don't control the character at this point. When the cutscene ends, then I can continue to play. The second example will include Cinemachine and playing with cameras. The cutscene will start when the player enters the trigger area. Then we switch cameras and give a hint to the player. Following this course is super easy. You can download the whole Unity project, open the scene, and start following the course right away. In addition, you can even download the completed project. Hello everyone, this is a quick guide on how to follow this course. The first thing you need to do is to download the project. Then you need to extract the files. After that, open Unity Hub. We need to open the project, find the location, and then wait for the Unity Hub to set up the project. Maybe you will get a warning that you are not using the same version, but that's fine. Most likely it will work with your version. I'm using 2022 LTS. When you open the project, find the scene folder and open the example 1 scene. Everything is prepared in the scene and you can follow the course from this point. Also, if you want, you can download the completed project with everything done. Of course, if you wish, you can use your assets and sprites. Choose the best option for you and see you in the next lecture. Let's set up timeline. Okay, first we need to open Package Manager. Make sure Unity registry is selected and search for the timeline. Then install it if it's not installed by default. To open the timeline window, go to Window, Sequencing, Timeline. I will just place it here at the bottom. To start creating a timeline, we need to select a game object. Let's create a new game object. I call it Example Timeline. Make sure that object is selected and click Create. This will create a director component and a timeline asset. Let's create a new folder for the timeline assets. I will call the asset Timeline Intro because it will be used for the intro cutscene. As you can see, now we have a timeline. Also, we have a Playable Director component. This component determines which timeline asset we use and when to play it. For this example, we can leave Play on Awake checked. That means the timeline will start playing as soon as we load the level. By default, the timeline is using frames, but let's change that to seconds. I think it's easier to work that way. Click on the Settings button and choose Seconds. Then lock the timeline window. If you don't lock it, the window will lose focus and become empty every time you select another object. And we are pretty much done with the setup. In the next lectures, we will add tracks to the timeline and create cutscenes. See you there! Hello again everyone, in this tutorial I will show you how to use a timeline to animate objects and create cutscenes. Here is the end result. This is all animated, I don't control the character. After the cutscene ends, then we can control the character and continue to play. As you can see, we will learn how to use animations with the timeline, how to move objects, how to use sound in cutscenes, and much more. To create this cutscene, we first need to animate this player sprite object. Remember, this is not the real playable character. This is just an object with a sprite renderer component. We use sprite that represents our character. To animate it on the timeline, we need to use an animation track. To create tracks, we can right-click here on the timeline window or click on the plus button. We need an animation track. As you can see, the animation track expects animator. Drag in the player sprite object. Since we don't have animator on that object, choose to create it. Now you can see that the animator component was created on the object. We don't need to add a controller or anything, we just need animator. Next, let's use the idle animation of the real playable character. To show you what I mean, I will enable the real character. You don't have to do this, just watch. I will open the animation window and place it like this. Let's zoom in a little bit. To preview animation, we need to unlock the timeline. Now you can see the idle animation. Of course, I created more animations for this character, but as I said, first we will need idle. So let's find the idle animation clip in the assets. Here is the idle animation clip we need. I will just reset things, disable the real character, move animation window, select the example timeline and lock the screen again. Now drag the idle animation clip into the timeline. We can move the clip along the timeline. Also, we can change the duration. Let's move it to the start. Make sure that preview is enabled and then press the play button on the timeline. You can see the idle animation. Let's add another animation. We need a run animation clip. Adjust the position and duration. Let's see it now. After idle, we have run animation. Nice. Now we need to animate the position of the character while the run animation is active. We need to move our character somewhere here next to the crab. To do that, we need to create another animation track. Use the same animator from the player sprite. The movement needs to start when the run animation starts, so set the marker at that point. Then press the record button. Select the object. Right-click on the position and choose Add Key. As you can see, that created one keyframe with the current position values on the timeline. Move the marker at the end of the run animation and then change the position. Press the record button again to stop recording. Let's try it. As you can see, the character moves. However, there is one issue. You can notice that the movement is not linear. We have acceleration at the start and deceleration at the end. Let's fix it. Open the animation window. Then double-click on the animation track. You will see keyframes in the animation window. Here we can move them and adjust the position. Notice that the change is updated on the timeline. OK, we need to select all keyframes, right-click, both tangents, and select linear. Let's see it now. Much better, the movement is nice and even. Here is one tip. If you need to adjust the position of animated objects, you can select the animation track and find offset option in the inspector. For example, you can adjust the Y position of the object if you need it. Let's press the play button to see what we have done, and remember that the timeline will start as soon as we load the level since we have Play on Awake enabled. Nice. You can see when the timeline stops. Of course, we need to finish it. In the next tutorial, we will animate a small conversation between our character and the crab. Then the character will attack him, and that will be the end of the cutscene. Hi everyone, let's continue with our cutscene. In this tutorial, we will see how to use the activation track. I will just enable two prefabs so I can show you animations. The idea is to use those two animations in the timeline. The animation is nothing special. I will open the animation window. Here you can see the keyframes for one of the animations. Okay, now I will delete the prefabs. We will need another animation track. Here I have one test object. It has sprite renderer and animator components. Let's rename it to question. Drag it to the animator position. Now we need to use the animation clip that I showed you. Place it somewhere here. Let's copy and paste the idle animation of the character. Adjust the position of the object a little bit. Now we can try it. First, you will notice that we can see the object from the start. It's active all the time. We need to fix that. The animation is good. Then again, the object is still active. To solve this problem, we can use the activation track. We use activation tracks to enable and disable objects. Let's right-click and create one activation track. As you can see, it expects a game object. Let's drag in the question object. Now we need to adjust the active zone. It determines when the object will be active. In this case, it needs to be active at the same time as the animation. Let's try it. We can't see the object at the start, that is good. Then we have animation, and it disappears. Nice. However, you need to be careful when using activation tracks. There are some cases when objects will not be disabled automatically after the animation, so we need to do it manually. Let me show you. I will change the duration of the idle animation so the cutscene ends at the same time as the activation zone ends. Now if we try it, the start is fine, we don't see the object, but after the animation, the object is not disabled. To make sure that the object will be disabled, you need to click on the activation track. In the inspector, you should see the post-playback state. It determines what will happen to the object after the activation zone. To make sure that object disappears, we need to select inactive. That will disable the object. Let's try it now. After the animation, the object is disabled. Notice that the timeline has a lot of tracks. We can group tracks to keep it clean and organized. That is the material for the next tutorial. Hello everyone, let's organize our timeline a little bit. To create a track group, let's right-click and choose track group. I will rename it to question. Now select the animation and activation tracks that control the question game object and drag them under the question group. Then you can minimize and maximize the group as you need. It looks much cleaner and more organized. Here is your first mini challenge. Create this response animation from the crab. You will need to use one animation and one activation track. Then you can add another track group if you want. To animate the response, we need another object. Duplicate the question object. move it to the right and rename it. Then we need a new animation track. It will use the animator from the response object. Then drag in the response animation clip. We can increase the duration. I will set 2 animation cycles. This is how it will look. I would like to invert the direction of the object. We can achieve it by changing the X scale to -1. Then adjust the position. Next, let's create one activation track. Use the response game object. Then adjust the activation zone. Don't forget to set the post-playback state to inactive. Then we can create another track group. It will be for the response tracks. Let's try it. This looks nice and everything works. In the next tutorial, we will animate the attack and see what we need to do if the animation contains animation events. Hi again, let's add an attack animation to the timeline. This will be different because the attack animation has animation events. Let me show you. Again, I'm showing the real playable character. I will select the attack animation. This is how it looks. Notice that I use animation events in the animation. Those events will cause errors on the timeline. We can test it. Let's select the timeline, drag in the attack animation, and adjust it a little bit. Let's try it. Here comes the attack, and we get one error. In the console, you can see that animation events are the reason. This means that every animation that has animation events will cause problems. So, how to fix it? I have one solution. If you have any other solutions, please comment and let me know. Maybe there is another solution or Unity will fix it in the future. The idea is to create the same animation but without events. So I will find sprites that we use in the animation, select the sprites and drag them into the scene. This will automatically create animation. I will call it Attack Timeline. You can see it's the same animation. Just make sure that the frame rate is identical. I think that it was 10 in the original animation. Then we can delete the object, select the timeline. We can delete the original attack animation from the timeline. Let's find our copy animation, place it just after idle. Let's try it now. Here is the attack. Let's check the console. No errors. Nice. For some reason, in these assets, attack effects are on separate sprite sheets. So I will quickly add this attack effect. Place it somewhere here. Of course, we need animation and activation tracks. Use the attack effect object. Then drag in the animation. Adjust the position a little bit. It needs to be the same duration as your attack animation. But usually attack and attack effects are on the same sprite sheet, so you don't need to do this. Then change the active zone. Make sure that post-playback state is inactive. Then create another track group. This is how it looks. Let's try it. Nice. That is all for this tutorial. In the next one, we will add a death animation for the crab, and I will show you animation extrapolation. Hello everyone, let's find out more about animation extrapolation. As an example, we will use that animation. Here I have the enemy prefab. We don't really need a real enemy, we can just use sprite. Before we delete it, let's copy the position. Then we can delete it and find the sprite we need. Now we can paste the position. I will quickly change the name. To animate Krabby, we need one animation track. Create an animator on the object. Now let's find that animation. Drag it on the timeline. Now we need to position it right. The death animation needs to start when the player swings the sword. That is somewhere here. But notice one detail. You can move the marker anywhere before the animation starts. As you can see, the first frame of the death animation is active. This is because of extrapolation settings. Notice two icons, one before and one after the animation. The icons show extrapolation states. If you click on the animation on the timeline, in the inspector, you will see extrapolation settings. Pre-extrapolate defines what happens before the animation, and post-extrapolate defines what happens after the animation. By default, both options are hold. For pre-extrapolation, this means that the first frame of the animation is displayed even before the animation starts. That is why we see the first frame from the start of the cutscene. We can change that option. You can see we have a couple of choices. Let's choose none. Notice that the icon disappeared and we can see the default sprite. By default sprite, I mean the sprite we use in the sprite renderer. That sprite can change as we animate the object. Next, let's see post-extrapolation. With the option hold, post-extrapolation will hold the last frame of the animation. Let's try it. For now, just ignore that Krabby doesn't have idle animation. You can see the default sprite. And after the animation, we hold the last active frame. Let's add idle animation. Notice that now the death animation doesn't have the pre-extrapolate option. That is because we have an animation that comes before the death animation. For the idle animation, we need the loop option for both extrapolations. As you can see, the animation is repeating. Just notice that with the loop option selected, the position of the animation determines the first frame of the animation at the start of the cutscene. And that is about extrapolation. Maybe you will use it in some situations. Hello everyone, let's see how to add sound to the cutscene. First we need to create an audio track. As you can see, it expects audio source. So let's create a new empty game object. Then we can add the audio source component. Drag the object into the empty field. Now let's add background music. Let's try it. You can hear the music. If you want to test it in the play mode, make sure that sound is on. Everything works. Let's go through some options. Select the audio clip on the timeline. In the inspector, you can see some settings. For example, we can change the volume. Notice that the final volume is calculated from multiple sources. It's a combination of clip, track and audio source. If you select the track, you will see some options. Here is the volume. So that is important to understand. You can tweak the volume on the clip and on the track separately. And we can also change the volume and other settings using audio source. If you now take a look at the clip, you will see every volume setting and the final calculation. Next, let's create fade in and fade out effects for the music. For the fade in effect, we need to increase ease in duration. Let's hear it now. Much better. Move the clip to the start. Then let's create a fade out effect. This is a bit longer music clip. Let's change the duration. I will make it a bit longer than animations. Then increase ease out duration to create the fade out effect. Let's hear it. Nice. Next, let's add an attack sound. We can just drag in the clip and that will create an audio track on the timeline. We can use the same audio source. Now let's adjust the position of the attack sound. Let's hear it. Nice. Here is the full preview in the game window. Nice. We can just quickly create another track group for the sounds. And that's it for this tutorial. Hello everyone, in this tutorial we will learn how to control the character and continue to play after the cutscene ends. First we can delete or disable our player sprite object. Then let's enable the player prefab. The idea is to use animator from the prefab. Let's simply drag the prefab to animator tracks. Since we plan to continue playing after the cutscene, we need to extend the idle animation to the end of the cutscene. Now it will end at the same time as the sound. We can try it. As you can see, when the cutscene ends, I can control the character. It's that simple. But there is one hidden problem. Let's try it again. Notice that I can use controls and affect the character. We need to disable and enable player controls. To execute that, we will use timeline signals. We use signals as communication channels between the timeline and other objects and systems from the scene. A timeline signal is constructed from three pieces: signal asset, signal emitter, and signal receiver. We will create signal emitter that will take signal asset. Signal receiver will listen for signals from the signal emitter and execute signal orders. Let's see how to set up signals. First, we need to show markers on the timeline. You can click on the pin button here, or you can right-click on the timeline numbers and select Show Markers. You will see one track for markers. Right-click on the track and create one signal emitter. Note that you can move the emitter along the timeline. In Inspector, you can see that we need to create a signal and signal receiver. Let's create a signal receiver first. You can read here that receiver was created on the timeline object. If you select the timeline game object, you can see the receiver component. Select the emitter again. Now let's create a signal. I will call it disable signal since we will use it to disable controls. You can notice that here we choose what signal to emit from this emitter, and we can also create new signals. As you can see here, every signal has a reaction. A reaction determines what will happen when we emit the signal. Remember, we need to disable controls, so let's drag in the player. Now we have access to all components that the player has. Before choosing a function, let's go to the player controls script. I created two functions. One will just disable and another will enable controls. Notice that I'm using the new input system. This course is not about the new input system, but if you want to learn more about it, check my other courses. Back to Unity and select the emitter. From the player controls script, we need to use the disable controls function. Note that you can add more reactions to one signal. So if you need to do more things at the same time, this is how you can do it. Now we need to move the emitter to the start because we need to disable controls when the cutscene starts. Let's create another emitter. Move it to the end of the cutscene. Then we can create a new signal here. Or we can go to the project window, right-click, create, signal. I will call it enable signal. Select the emitter, choose enable signal. We can add one reaction by clicking on this button, or we can select the object with the receiver component, that is the timeline object. We need to add one reaction and choose enable signal. Click on the plus button, then drag in the player. From the player controls script, we need to use the enable controls function. Now you can select the emitter and see that everything is set correctly. Let's try it. Now I'm trying to control the character, but nothing happens because controls are disabled. After the cutscene ends, I can control the character. Nice. Now I will show you another procedure for using signals. You can also create signal track. It expects signal receiver. Usually I create a new empty game object. Add signal receiver component. Drag in that game object. With right-click on the signal track, we can create emitters. Now you would just repeat the process, create signals and add reactions. That is all for this lecture. See you in the next one. Hello everyone, in this tutorial I will show you how to use Cinemachine and cameras with timeline to create cutscenes. We will also see how to activate a cutscene when the player enters certain areas. In this simple example, we control the character. When he enters the activation area, the cutscene starts. It will change cameras and in some way give a hint to the player or whatever you want to achieve. After the cutscene ends, we can continue to play. Let's start. First, we need to import Cinemachine, open Package Manager, make sure you select Unity Registry, and then search Cinemachine. Install the package. After installation, we can right-click in the hierarchy, Cinemachine, and you will see different types of cameras that we can use. Since this is a 2D game, let's select a 2D camera. I will call it Follow Cam since this camera will follow the player. As you can see in the inspector, we created a virtual camera. To make the camera follow the player, we need to change some settings. Note that I will not go into details about settings because this is not the main point of this course. I have a great tutorial and courses about setting up Cinemachine. Feel free to check it out. Let's quickly change the size of the camera. Then we need to choose a target to follow. That will be the player. You can see the edges of the camera. We can also expand the body settings. adjust the offset on y-axis, and I will also disable damping. Now let's create another 2D camera. This will be a static camera. Make sure that it's the same size and set body to none. Pay attention, sometimes when you create virtual cameras, the position on Z-axis can be messed up. So let's set it right. Then let's move our static camera. It needs to show this enemy and the key. We can duplicate the camera, rename it, then move it to the door. So we are telling the player that he needs to pick up the key to open the door. To make sure that our follow camera is displayed before other cameras, we need to increase the priority. Nice. Now let's create one timeline. We need a new empty object. I will call it timeline. Make sure that the timeline window is open and click create to create a timeline asset. I call it camera cutscene. For now, we can leave play on awake enabled, so it's easier to test, but later we will disable this and activate the cutscene manually. Lock the timeline. To control cameras, we need to create a Cinemachine track. As you can see, it expects the Cinemachine brain component. The Cinemachine brain is located on the main camera, so drag in the main camera. The cutscene can start with follow cam. Drag it into the timeline, place it at the start, then make it a bit shorter. Next, we need our first static camera. Place it after the follow cam. Let's try it. First, we see our follow camera, and then it snaps to the first static camera. After the cutscene, it will snap back to the follow cam. Of course, we need a smooth transition between cameras. To achieve it, we need to blend cameras like this. Transition smoothness and duration depend on the length of the blending part. Let's try it now. Nice, that looks much better. Let's add another static camera. And we can finish it with follow cam. This is how the Cinemachine track should look like. Let's see the whole cutscene. Transition to the first static camera, then the second, and we go back to follow cam. Nice. Of course, we should disable controls when the cutscene starts so that the player can't move. Again, we will use timeline signals just as in the previous lectures. So if you skipped that part, please go back to it. Now I will go a little bit faster, show markers and create a new emitter. Add signal receiver, emit disable signal, and add reaction. Drag in the player and choose the disable controls function. Create a new emitter. It needs to emit enable signal. Add another reaction. Again, drag in the player, but this time use enable controls. Nice. In the next lecture, we create activation area. Hello everyone, let's continue with the course and manually enable the cutscene. Now we can select the timeline and in Playable Director disable Play on Awake. The idea is to start the cutscene when the player enters the trigger area. I have one object prepared. I will enable it. As you can see, it needs to have a kinematic rigid body 2D, box collider 2D, The is trigger option needs to be selected, and we need one activation script. You can see the position of the collider. The player will for sure touch the collider, he can't jump over it or something. So it's important how and where to place your activation collider. Before we open the activation script, let's select the player. Make sure you set the tag player. Now we can open the script. First, we need the Unity Engine Playables namespace. Then we need a reference for the Playable Director component. As you can see, we use the onTriggerEnterToD function. For every object that enters the trigger, we check the tag. If the object has the tag player, then we need to start the cutscene. To start the cutscene, we use Playable Director.play. After that, I just disable the collider so we don't get multiple calls. Go back to Unity. As you can see, we need to assign Playable Director. It's on the timeline game object. Drag it in. Let's try it. I can play the game and move around. When I enter the trigger, the cutscene starts. Let's watch it. And then I can continue to play. Nice. That is all for this course. I hope you learned something about the timeline and cutscenes. They can really make your game look more alive and fun. Thanks for watching and see you soon.